In Baghdad, in the early years of the 9th century, there was a price for wisdom, and it was paid in gold. The caliph Al-Ma'mun ruled the largest city in the world. His agents traveled the breadth of the known earth with a single commission: find the books. Find the Greek manuscripts gathering dust in the lapsed libraries of Byzantium and Alexandria and Persia, the works of Aristotle, of Euclid, of Ptolemy, and Galen, and Archimedes, and bring them to Baghdad to be translated into Arabic. And the men who did this, the translators who could turn the philosophy of dead Greeks into the living language of the Abbasid court, were among the most valued men in the empire. The most celebrated of them were paid, according to accounts that have come down to us, the weight of each completed manuscript in gold. Think about what that means. A book set on one pan of a scale, gold poured into the other pan until the two balanced. And that was the wage, not for the wisdom itself, which no scale could weigh, but for the labor of carrying it across the gulf of language so that it would not be lost. Now hold that image, because here's why it matters to you, an American 1,200 years later. The Aristotle that the American founders read, the Aristotle whose analysis of the mixed constitution we traced last week, the Aristotle who stands behind Madison and Adams and the whole architecture of checks and balances, that Aristotle very nearly did not survive. In the Christian West, after Rome fell, most of his works were lost for almost 600 years. They survived because scholars in Baghdad bought them by the ounce, and scholars in Córdoba argued over them for lifetimes, and scholars in Toledo, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish together, carried them back into Latin so that a man like Thomas Aquinas could read them, and through Aquinas so that the men in Philadelphia could inherit them. The golden thread of this series runs straight through the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Most school books never mention it. And there is a second thread, older still, and it does not come from Greece at all. The single most radical political idea in the American founding, more radical than anything in Aristotle, is the idea that even the king stands under the law. That the man with the crown is not above the rule, but bound by it, exactly as the humblest farmer is bound. That idea did not come from Athens. It came from a Hebrew prophet 3,000 years ago, warning a people who had come to him demanding a king. 3 cities. Athens, which asked how a good government should be built. Jerusalem, which asked what a free people owed to a law higher than any king. And Baghdad, standing for Córdoba and Cairo and Toledo too, which asked what the ancients had known and whether it could be saved. 3 questions, 3 threads, 1 cord. And the founders, 14 centuries after the last of these civilizations passed its peak, wove all 3 into the framework of a new republic. That is the story of this hour. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 3 of the series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. Today, Athens, Jerusalem, and the House of Wisdom. This episode corresponds to Article 3 of our written series, published this past Sunday on our Substack page. Last week, in the Classical Inheritance, we left Cicero on the road to Forme, offering his neck to the soldiers, and we drew from Greece and Rome the instruments the founders would use. Aristotle's Science of Constitutions, Polybius's Wheel of Decay, Cicero's Law above the Law. But the thread does not begin and end in the classical world. Today, it widens. We turn first to Jerusalem, and the Hebrew tradition that gave the West its most radical political idea. And then we turn to the astonishing story of how, when Aristotle had all but vanished from the Christian West, it was scholars in Baghdad and Córdoba who preserved the Greek inheritance and handed it back. As always, this podcast expands upon themes that we could not address in the article. It brings in additional primary sources and addresses the complexity that written format cannot fully explore. So with that said, let us begin.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
The Hebrew Bible is many things. It is genealogy and ritual law, prophecy and chronicle, poetry of unmatched power, and legal codes of considerable severity. But woven through its historical and prophetic books is something that no other civilization of the ancient Near East produced: the most sustained critique of state power that has come down to us from a pre-classical world. Let's be precise about what type of critique it is, because it is not what the Greek would have produced. The Hebrews did not write political philosophy in a systematic sense. They did not compose treaties classifying constitutions or arguing from first principles the way Aristotle did. They told stories of kings and prophets, of slaves and liberators, of covenants kept and covenants broken. And the political theology carried in those stories became one of the most consequential intellectual inheritance in human history. Three features of that inheritance matter for our story, and I want to take them one at a time. Let's begin with the covenant. The relationship between God and Israel in the Hebrew Bible is structured as a covenant, and the word matters. A covenant is not a decree. It is a formal agreement between two parties with terms, obligations, and consequences for breach. At Sinai, when the law is given, the people do not merely receive it, they accept it. All that the Lord hath spoken we will do, they answer. The founding act of Israel as a political community is an act of consent. Stop and consider how strange that is against the backdrop of the ancient world. The covenant is not imposed by a distant power on a passive people. It requires the people's agreement. And that structure, agreement, consent, a community constituted by a compact rather than by force, prefigured by more than 2,000 years the social contract tradition that would emerge in early modern Europe and reach its sharpest expression in the American founding. This is not a faint or speculative connection. It runs through American history by a traceable route. The Mayflower Compact of 1620, the first self-governing founding document of English North America, is structured as a covenant in the Hebrew sense, a people binding themselves together by mutual agreement before God. The Puritan towns of New England were organized as covenanted communities. There was an entire strand of Reformed Protestant thought, federal theology, from the Latin foedus, meaning covenant, that took the covenant as the structural relationship binding God, ruler, and people. The American emphasis on compact, on consent, and on limited delegated authority owes a great deal to this Hebrew inheritance, carried across the Atlantic by the Pilgrims and the Puritans and built into the foundations of colonial self-government. Even the king is under the law. Here's the second feature, and the one I called out in the open. It is the most radical political idea in the American founding. In the political theology of ancient Near East, the king was typically a god, or the son of a god, or a hand-picked representative of the gods on earth. The Pharaoh of Egypt was himself divine. The Code of Hammurabi from around 1750 before Christ presents the law as the gift of the king to his people. The king is the source of the law, the fountain from which it flows. Across Mesopotamia, royal inscriptions celebrated the intimate bond between the king and the gods who had chosen him. The king made the law, and the king was, in any meaningful sense, above it. The Hebrew tradition broke with that entire framework. In the Hebrew Bible, the law is given by God to the whole people, and the king, when Israel finally gets a king, is bound by that law no less than the poorest farmer in the kingdom. The 17th chapter of Deuteronomy lays down the condition of Israelite kingship, and the requirement is astonishing. The king must write out a copy of the law for himself, keep it beside him, and read it in all the days of his life, so that, in the words of the text, his heart be not lifted up above his brethren. The king is not the source of the law. The king is its student. The crown does not place him above his countrymen. It binds him to read every day the same law that binds them. And the prophetic tradition gave that subordination teeth. When King David arranged the death of Uriah the Hittite so that he could take Uriah's wife Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan came to him, not with an army, not with an office, but with a story. He told David a parable about a rich man who owned vast flocks and who, rather than slaughter one of his own animals to feed a traveler, stole and killed the single beloved lamb of the poor man. David, hearing it, was filled with rage and pronounced judgment. The rich man deserves to die. And Nathan turned to the king of Israel and said 4 words that ring across 3,000 years. Thou art that man. The king of Israel had to stand and hear from a man with no power but the law behind him that he had committed a capital crime under the same statute that bound his subjects. And the pattern recurs. When Ahab and Jezebel arranged the judicial murder of Naboth to seize his ancestral vineyard, the prophet Elijah confronted the king in the vineyard itself and pronounced the ruin of his entire line. The king sins. The prophet confronts. The law remains supreme. No earthly authority, however high it sits, escapes higher accountability. Let us consider how radical that structure is. It established, in the religious dogma of a small and frequently conquered people, the principle that authority is limited by a law it does not control, and that the function of the truth teller is to remind authority of its limits, no matter the cost. The prophets who did this were not always heard. Several of them were killed for it, but the principle survived their deaths, and it became part of the political grammar of the entire Western world. When an American stands up and says that no president is above the law, he is speaking, whether he knows it or not, in a Hebrew accent. Samuel's warning. And now we come to the keystone of the Hebrew inheritance, the passage with which our article opened, and the one I want to read to you with no music, no interruption, because it deserves to stand on its own. The setting is the 8th chapter of the first book of Samuel. The prophet Samuel is old. The elders of Israel come to him with a demand. They want a king. A king, they say, to judge us like all nations. They are tired of being different. They want a normal kingdom like their neighbors with a proper ruler in the ordinary ancient sense. Samuel is troubled by this and he prays. And God tells Samuel to do what the people ask. But first, to warn them, to tell them honestly, fully, what a king will do. Listen to the warning, and listen especially to what kind of warning it is, because Samuel does not say a word about bad kings. He does not warn them about a king who might abuse his power or a tyrant who might break the rules. He warns them about the manner of the king. What a king, simply by being a king, by the nature of the office itself, will do. This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. And some shall run before his chariots, and he will appoint them his captains over thousands, and captains over fifties. And he will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants, and your maidservants, and your goodliest young men, and your asses, and put them to his work. And he will take a tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. That last phrase, and ye shall be his servants. The Hebrew word translated servants there is avadim, and it is the same word translated slaves everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. It is the word used for the condition of Israel in Egypt. So hear what Samuel is actually telling them. The people who fled bondage in Egypt, who crossed the sea out of slavery into freedom, are being warned that in demanding a king, they will reduce themselves to bondage again in their own land, under a king of their own choosing. The Hebrew word for what Pharaoh made them is the Hebrew word for what their own king will make them. Now, the listener who has walked with us through the first two episodes recognizes immediately what Samuel is describing, because it is the liberty test, stated 3,000 years early. Look at the catalog. The king will take your sons for his wars. The king will take your daughters for his household. The king will take your fields and your vineyards and the best of your harvest. The king will take a tenth of everything and a portion of your labor. The king will do on a national scale the exact things that, done by a private man, would be instantly recognizable as theft, as kidnapping, as enslavement. No neighbor of yours could march into your field and conscript your son and seize your harvest. The king does it by right of an office whose authority no one can challenge once it has been granted. That is the liberty test in its oldest dress. Can a people delegate to a king a power that no individual among them has ever possessed? Samuel says, watch what happens when they try. The fancy hat does not change the nature of the taking. It only makes the taking lawful. Samuel saw that with perfect clarity 28 centuries before the libertarian tradition would put it into modern words. And the heart of his warning is structural, not personal. The question is not whether the king will be a good man or a bad man. The question is what the office of a king is and what its mere existence will require of the people who establish it. And here's the part that should stop every one of us cold. The people hear the warning, the full, honest, devastating warning, and they do not relent. Nay, they tell Samuel, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. They hear exactly what it will cost, and they choose it anyway. They want the security of a strong man who will fight their battles for them, and they are willing to pay for it with their sons, their harvest, and in the end, their freedom. The rest of the book of Kings is the long, unsparing record of Samuel's warning coming true. I will let you decide for yourself how ancient that story really is. There's one more Hebrew narrative we cannot leave out because it became quite literally the founding story of the American revolutionaries told about themselves. It is the Exodus, the liberation of an enslaved people from a tyrannical empire. The Exodus was the central political narrative of the Hebrew people. recited every year at Passover, woven into the law of ritual Israelite life. And it turned out to be the most usable biblical story imaginable for a colonial people preparing to overthrow what they regarded as the tyranny of a distant king. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth in 1620 understood themselves as a new Israel, fleeing a corrupt Egypt for a promised land across the sea. The Puritans of Massachusetts Bay built an elaborate typology in which the Atlantic crossing was their Red Sea. And by the time of the Revolution, Exodus imagery saturated American preaching and pamphlet alike. Sermons compared George III to Pharaoh. Tax collectors became taskmasters. The struggle for independence became a march out of bondage. And here's the detail I love most, because it shows you how deep this ran. On the 4th of July, 1776, the very day the Declaration was adopted, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to design a seal for the new nation. The committee was Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. And when these three men, the intellectual heart of the Revolution, were asked to imagine the visual symbol of America, two of the three reached first for the Exodus. Franklin proposed the scene of Moses standing on the shore, stretching his hand over the sea to drown Pharaoh in his chariot, with rays from a pillar of fire reaching down from the clouds, and a motto: rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Jefferson proposed the children of Israel in the wilderness, led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire at night. Adams, who had less feel for symbolism, reached for the Greek tradition instead and proposed Hercules, choosing between virtue and sloth. The committee's designs were not adopted. The seal, as we know, is an eagle with a pyramid, came later. But the proposals tell you where the founders' political imagination lived. Asked to picture American itself, and two of the three drafters of the Declaration reached for the story of a people walking out of slavery. The founders' imagination was Hebrew before it was Greek. And Franklin's motto, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God, Jefferson liked it so much that he took it for his own personal seal and used it the rest of his life. This was not casual familiarity. Hebrew was taught as a regular part of the curriculum at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and William and Mary, all through the colonial period. Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale, corresponded with rabbis and made Hebrew study mandatory for his divinity students. John Adams cited the Hebrew Republic as a constitutional model and worked through the institutions of ancient Israel at length in his great Defense of the Constitutions. For the educated founder, the Hebrew political tradition was not exotic background. It was an operational reference, reached for as freely as Aristotle or Cicero. So let me sum up what Jerusalem gave the American inheritance, because it comes down to four propositions. That political community is constituted by covenant, by consent, rather than by force. That even the highest earthly authority is bounded by a higher law it did not make. That the truth teller's vocation is to remind power of its limits, whatever the personal cost. And that the office of unaccountable rule, the office of king in Samuel's sense, is dangerous by its very nature, regardless of the character of the man who holds it. Those four propositions ran straight into the Declaration, into the Constitution's careful enumeration of limited powers, into the whole American tradition of prophetic descent, and into the bedrock assumption that the people who make a government keep the standing to call it into account. In the year 476, the last Roman emperor of the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. As a political event, it was almost anticlimactic. The Western Empire had been hollowed out for some time. But the cultural collapse that came with it was anything but. Over the next 2 centuries, the institutions that had preserved and transmitted the Greek and Roman intellectual inheritance in the western half of the empire simply fell apart. The schools closed, the libraries were scattered, burned, or abandoned. The administrative machinery that had ordered intellectual life from Britain to Spain disintegrated. And here's the loss that matters for our story. By the 7th century, the Latin West had access to only a fraction of the Greek philosophical corpus. Plato survived mainly through one dialogue, the Timaeus, in a partial Latin translation. And Aristotle, the Aristotle we spent last week with, the foundation of Western political science, he survived in the West mainly through a handful of his works on logic, translated by Boethius in the early 6th century. The rest of him, the metaphysics, the physics, the work on the soul, the politics, the ethics, nearly the whole towering body of Aristotelian philosophy was effectively lost to the Latin West for almost 600 years. Lost to the West, but not lost to the world. And this is where the story leaves the path most of us were never taught. Greek manuscripts survived in Byzantium, where Greek remained a living language of scholarship. And in the 8th century, a new civilization arose that would do something Byzantium itself never quite managed. It would actively hunt down the Greek philosophical and scientific corpus, translate it systematically, comment on it for centuries, and carry it forward. That civilization was the Islamic world. And the institution whose name became the symbol of that whole enterprise was the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate, founded in 750, moved its capital to a brand new city, Baghdad, in 762. Within a century, Baghdad was the largest city on earth. And under a line of caliphs, Al-Mansur, Al-Mahdi, Al-Rashidi, and above all, Al-Ma'mun, the Abbasids organized what historians simply call the translation movement, a sustained, state-funded, centuries-long effort to obtain Greek manuscripts from Byzantium, from India, from the lapsed libraries of Alexandria, to render them into Arabic. And the motives were a fascinating mixture worth pausing on, because they tell you something true about how civilizations advance. Part of it was severely practical. The Abbasids ruled a vast multilingual empire that needed working knowledge. They needed medicine, astronomy, mathematics, engineering. They needed to calculate the direction of Mecca for prayer, which is a problem for spherical geometry. They needed to fix the Islamic lunar calendar, which is a problem of astronomy. Greek science answered practical needs, but part of it was something deeper than utility. A religious culture that, in this period, did not regard the pursuit of wisdom as a threat to faith. There's a famous saying attributed to the prophet, "Seek knowledge even unto China." The translation movement turned that disposition into an institution. By the end of the 9th century, almost the entire surviving body of Greek science and philosophy had been translated into Arabic, often in several competing versions. And the best translators, as we said, were paid the weight of the manuscript in gold. Now let's give a little bit more contextual honesty to this. The civilization that produced this magnificent intellectual achievement was an empire, built by conquest, sustained by tribute, and powered in significant part by slave labor and slave armies. The very openness that produced the translation movement existed in the same cities under the same caliphs along the ordinary institutional violence of imperial rule. This was not a modern liberal society. It was a medieval one, sophisticated in philosophy, expansionist in war, and bound by the moral assumptions of its age. The philosophical contributions of its scholars are real and unimpeachable. The empire those scholars served was not the founders' kind of republic. Both of those things are true at once, and this series will neither romanticize the politics of medieval Islamic civilization nor let its politics erase the genuine achievement of its scholars. We will hold both in our hands the way we held the wisdom and slavery of Aristotle last week. So let me introduce you to four of those scholars because their names deserve to be as familiar to you as Aristotle and Cicero. And for most of us, they are not. Al-Farabi. Abu Nasr al-Farabi was born around the year 870 in Central Asia, studied in Baghdad, spent much of his life in Damascus and Aleppo. Later, Islamic philosophers called him the second master, second only to Aristotle himself, the first master. His great political work was titled The Virtuous City, and he took up Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics and adapted their analysis to the conditions of an Islamic polity. His writings on logic and metaphysics and ethics became the foundation on which later Islamic philosophy was built. The measure of his stature is this. Avicenna, one of the greatest minds the Islamic world ever produced, said he had read Aristotle's metaphysics 40 times and still could not understand it until he read Al-Farabi's commentary, and the whole thing opened up. That brings us to Avicenna himself. Ibn Sina was born around 980 in what is now Uzbekistan. He was a physician, a philosopher, a scientist, and a statesman all at once. His canon of medicine remained the standard medical textbook in European universities for 5 centuries after his death. Let that sink in. A textbook in active use for 500 years. His vast philosophical work, especially the book whose title means The Healing, was the most ambitious systematic philosophy the Islamic world produced before the 12th century. And he shaped the West in 2 ways, directly, through Latin translations that circulated in the European universities, and indirectly, through his influence on the man we turn to next, Averroes. Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Rushd, Latinized as Averroes, was born in 1126 in Córdoba, the capital of Muslim Spain, into a distinguished family of judges. He served as chief judge of Seville and then Córdoba, as a personal physician to 2 caliphs, and the single most prolific commentator on Aristotle that any medieval civilization produced. He wrote 3 separate commentaries, short, middle, and long, on virtually every major work of Aristotle, each calibrated to a different level of reader. His whole ambition was to recover what Aristotle actually meant, stripped of the later mystical accretions that earlier philosophy had layered on. He read Aristotle harder and more carefully than almost anyone in the medieval world on either side of the Mediterranean. And here's why Averroes matters to an American. When his commentaries reached the Latin West in the 13th century, translated out of Arabic into Latin, often in Toledo, often with the help of Jewish scholars, they did not merely carry Aristotle. They carried an interpretation of Aristotle. Latin medieval philosophy, including the towering synthesis of Thomas Aquinas, was shaped decisively by the way Averroes had read the text. Aquinas spent a substantial part of his career engaging Averroes, refining him, and in places refuting him. And Aquinas paid him the highest possible compliment. He simply called him the commentator. Not a commentator, the commentator. The figure whose reading of Aristotle had to be answered before any further work on Aristotle could even begin. And Dante, a century later, placed Averroes in limbo among the great virtuous pagans, identifying him with a single phrase: Averroes, who made the great commentary. So consider what this means. When the founders read their Aristotle, they read a text whose interpretive shape had been set in significant part by a Muslim judge from the 12th century Córdoba. They did not always know this. By the 18th century, the train of transmission had become invisible to them. But it was there. Without Averroes, the medieval Aristotle on which the entire scholastic tradition was built would have been a different and lesser text. And now to the fourth, the one who connects directly back to last week. Ibn Khaldun was born in Tunis in 1332, educated in the standard Islamic curriculum, and served in government posts across North Africa and Spain before settling in Cairo as a judge and historian. His masterwork, the Muqaddimah, the introduction to his world history, and it is one of the most original works of social and political analysis produced anywhere in the medieval period. Ibn Khaldun is often described, perhaps a little too quickly, as a kind of Islamic Polybius. And while there is some truth to that, there's also a distinction that matters. Ibn Khaldun's central idea is a concept he called Abbasiyya, usually translated as group feeling or social cohesion. It refers to the bonds of solidarity that hold a tribe or clan or community together against outside threats. Strong Abbasiyya, he argued, is the precondition of political success. A community whose members are bound by intense loyalty, shared kinship, shared hardship, and a common purpose can overcome larger, richer, more sophisticated society whose own internal cohesion has gone soft. That, he said, is how hardy peoples from the margins have repeatedly conquered wealthy, settled civilization across the whole history of the Mediterranean and the Near East. But Abbasiyya decays, and here's the cycle. The conquering generation, hardened by struggle and bound by shared sacrifice, takes power and founds a dynasty. The next generation, raised in the comfort of palaces and cities, keeps some of that cohesion, but begins to lose its edge. The third generation, fully softened by luxury, mistaking its inherited authority for personal achievement, has lost that cohesion that founded the dynasty in the first place. The fourth generation rules a civilization that is wealthy, refined, and hollow, and is conquered, in its turn, by the next hardy people with strong Abbasiyya coming over the horizon. And the cycle begins anew. Now, last week we walked through Polybius and his cycle, the anacyclosis. So you are right to hear an echo. But listen to the difference because it is quite instructive. Polybius' cycle was about the cycle of constitutional forms. Monarchy decaying into tyranny, tyranny overthrown into aristocracy, and so on around the wheel. Ibn Khaldun's cycle is about something else. The rise and fall of social cohesion, the binding solidarities that make any political success possible at all. Polybius is describing the machinery of government. Ibn Khaldun is describing the people who operate the machinery. The two cycles run on different layers, and they may turn at different speeds, but they are entirely compatible. They are two views of the same kind of phenomena from different angles. A constitution can be beautifully designed and still go hollow if the people living under it have lost their cohesion. A people with a fierce cohesion can carry a poorly designed constitution for a good while, until their cohesion in turn decays. Polybius watched republics fall. Ibn Khaldun watched dynasties fall. Both were watching the same thing, just from different windows. The founders in 1787 surely did not read Ibn Khaldun. It was not translated into English until the 20th century. But the lesson he developed was recognizable in the classical sources they did read, and the deep caution he embodied, that no political order survives on its own design alone, that the people who run the machinery matter as much as the machine itself. This was a lesson they had absorbed from Polybius, from Plutarch's Lives of the Failed and Successful Statesmen, and from watching the French Revolution unfold in real time. Ibn Khaldun is now available to us in a way he was not available to them. And so he deepens the analytical tradition the founders inherited. He does not displace it. He complements it. The Greek inheritance was preserved, but the preservation alone would have been only an isolated cultural achievement if the inheritance had stayed locked in the Arabic in the libraries of Baghdad and Córdoba. The last act of the story is how it came home to the Latin West. And the mechanism of that homecoming is one of the most extraordinary stories in the whole history of ideas. The Toledo School. In 1085, Christian forces under Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile captured the Spanish city of Toledo. Toledo had been under Muslim rule for nearly 4 centuries, and the libraries of Toledo, public, private, institutional, were full. They held the entire Islamic philosophical corpus and its Arabic translations of Greek philosophy and science. Then the population of the city at the moment of its conquest was a genuine mixture: Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people living together with a great deal of bilingual and even trilingual capacity among the educated. The Archbishop of Toledo organized what later scholars would call the Toledo School of Translators, an ongoing collaborative effort to render those Arabic works into Latin for the Christian West. It continued under his successors and reached new heights under the remarkable king Alfonso X of Castile, known to history as Alfonso the Wise. Alfonso the Wise extended the project to include translations from Hebrew and the original works in Castilian Spanish. And across the 12th and 13th centuries, a steady stream of texts, Aristotle himself and the Islamic commentaries, and the original works in medicine and astronomy and mathematics. All of these flowed out of Toledo and similar centers in Sicily and southern Italy into Latin. By about the year 1280, the Latin West had recovered nearly the entire Aristotelian corpus that the Islamic world had preserved. It had arrived accompanied by the commentaries of Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, and many others. The lost Aristotle had come home. And I want to give particular attention to the Jewish scholars in this transmission because it was indispensable, and because of where it sits in the larger story this series tells. Many of the Sephardic Jews of medieval Spain were trilingual. They read Arabic for daily life and philosophy, Hebrew for religious scholarship, and the Latin or the Romance tongues of their Christian neighbors. That made them natural translators, copyists, and go-betweens, and they served at every stage of the work. The greatest figure of this Jewish dimension was Moses ben Maimonides, born in Córdoba in 1135, dying in Cairo in 1204. Maimonides wrote in Arabic, lived most of his life under Islamic rule, and was perhaps the greatest single synthesizer of Aristotelian philosophy and revealed religion the entire medieval period produced. His great work, The Guide for the Perplexed, was composed in Arabic around 1190. Translated into Hebrew and then Latin within decades, and became a touchstone for medieval Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy alike. And Aquinas, the Christian synthesizer, the man we turn to next week, cited him repeatedly by the respectful name Rabbi Moises, and drew on his handling of the hardest philosophical and theological questions in the Summa Theologiae itself. The debt was real, and it was acknowledged right there in the manuscripts. So look at what this medieval synthesis actually was at its most ambitious. Christian theologians in Paris were working with Greek philosophical texts that had been transmitted through Arabic translations, annotated by Muslim commentators, and rendered into Latin with the help of Jewish intermediaries. And in the writing of the synthesis, the Christian theologians cited them, their Muslim and Jewish predecessors, by name. Now, I want to be careful not paint this as some modern fantasy of interfaith harmony. It was not. These communities were not equal partners in a shared political order, and the relations among them ran the whole range from genuine collaboration to open religious warfare, depending on the time and the place. But at the level of the philosophical work itself, The synthesis was real. And the citations preserved the record who have contributed what? The footnotes, if you like, told the truth even where the politics did not. And of all these streams, they converge on one man, Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274 and who sits at the exact intersection of everything we have traced today. He read Aristotle in Latin translation that had passed through Arabic. He cited Averroes, the commentator, on practically every philosophical question he touched. He cited Avicenna and Al-Farabi. He cited Rabbi Moses, Maimonides. He cited Cicero and Augustine and the Hebrew prophets, and he wove it all together into a single theological and philosophical synthesis that would shape Western intellectual life for centuries. And that fed through the Catholic universities and the broader Christian tradition into the natural law tradition the American founders eventually received through their reading of Coke and Locke and the early modern legal writers. Aquinas is next week's subject, so I will not get ahead of the story. The point to fix here is only this. What reaches Aquinas and through Aquinas reaches Philadelphia is a synthesis of Athens, Greek philosophical reason, Jerusalem, Hebrew covenant and the moral seriousness of law above the king, Rome, Cicero's jurisprudence and natural law, and the Islamic and Jewish commentaries that preserved and developed every one of those threads across the centuries when the Latin West could not have done it alone. The founders inherited a synthesis, but it was never theirs alone to claim. It was, in the most exact sense of the words, a human inheritance, built up by every civilization that ever took seriously the questions of justice, of law, and the limits of legitimate power. And now, as this series always does, I owe you the strongest case against everything I have just told you, stated at its full strength, before I answer a word of it. There are 3 serious challenges to the account in this episode, and each one deserves a fair hearing. The first challenge is the theological, and it is the strongest of the 3. It says, in essence, that I have smuggled religion into the history of philosophy. The Hebrew tradition, the critic argues, is religious doctrine, not philosophical argument. And to put it alongside Aristotle and Cicero is to confuse 2 entirely different kinds of intellectual work. The Greeks gave us philosophy because they argued for their conclusions from reason, examining from competing claims and building systematic accounts that anyone can follow. The Hebrews gave us scripture, narrative, and revelation. Persuasive perhaps to those who already accept the underlying theology, but unable to ground a political order for anyone who does not. And so the argument goes, the founders drew on Greece and Rome because those traditions were genuinely philosophical and universally accessible, and their use of Hebrew imagery was just decoration, rhetorical color, not philosophical substance. That's a serious challenge. But the honest answer has 2 parts. First, the sharp line between philosophical argument and religious narrative is much more a feature of modern academic categories than of anything that existed in the 18th century, or in any of the centuries before it. The Greek philosophical tradition itself drew on religious sources. Plato's Republic ends with a religious myth. Aristotle's metaphysics terminates in an unmoved mover. Cicero's great natural law passage, the one we read last week, culminates in the claim that God is the author of the law that binds all rational beings. The old distinction between philosophy and theology was not the modern secular distinction at all. It was a distinction inside a shared framework, a framework that took for granted that there is a moral order in the universe and asked how it might be known. The Hebrew tradition contributed to that shared framework. And whether or not you accept its theological premises, the political claims it generated, that even kings are under the law, that authority requires accountability, that liberation from tyranny is a legitimate and praiseworthy thing, are claims you can evaluate on their merits as political claims entirely apart from the religion that first produced them. Second, The philosophical versus religious framing badly understates the operational role of the Hebrew tradition played in the actual thinking of the founders. They did not treat it as decoration. They studied Hebrew at college. They cited the institutions of ancient Israel in constitutional debate. They drew on covenant theology in the way they structured federal arrangements. The most famous American political slogan of the entire Revolutionary era, Franklin's "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," is simply unintelligible outside the Hebrew framework to put Exodus at the center of your political imagination. To call the Hebrew contribution decorative is to misread the historical record. The second challenge concerns the House of Wisdom, and it says I have overstated the Islamic role. Greek manuscripts, this argument runs, survived all along in Byzantium, and the recovery of Greek philosophy in the Latin West owes at least as much to direct Greek to Latin translation as it does to any Arabic intermediary. On the strongest version of this objection, the Islamic contribution was real but more limited than recent enthusiasm has made it sound, and the West would have recovered Aristotle anyway, perhaps more slowly, but eventually. This is a legitimate scholarly point, and it deserves a direct answer rather than a dismissal. The Byzantine transmission was real and important, especially later, after the Fourth Crusade in 1204 and the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Greek manuscripts and Greek scholars did flow directly into the West, and the Renaissance recovery of Plato in the 15th century owed far more to that direct Greek route than the Arabic. But, and this is the decisive point, for the recovery of Aristotle in the 12th and 13th century, the recovery that actually produced the scholastic synthesis, the recovery that actually produced and shaped Thomas Aquinas, that fed into the natural law tradition the founders inherited, for that, the Arabic transmission was decisive. The Latin translations that reached the University of Paris and Oxford and Bologna in those centuries were predominantly Arabic to Latin renderings, many of them made in Toledo. And the commentaries of Averroes and Avicenna and Al-Farabi and Maimonides arrived at the same time of the text of Aristotle they discussed. And they shaped the frame in which those texts were read. The Byzantine stream supplemented this and eventually surpassed it, but it did not produce the initial medieval recovery. On this, the scholarly consensus is solid, and it is the consensus this account has followed. The third challenge says that the synthesis I have described was not harmonious at all, but a conflict-ridden mess. And the exhibit the critics reach for is the Paris condemnations of 1277, when the Bishop of Paris formally condemned more than 200 propositions associated with the Averroes reading of Aristotle. There, the critic says, there is your beautiful synthesis. The Latin Church was busy condemning the very transmission you are celebrating, even as Aquinas was writing. And this one is simply correct on the facts. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The reception of Islamic transmitted Aristotle in the Latin West was contested. Propositions were condemned. Aquinas himself wrote polemics against certain Averroes readings. One of his works is titled bluntly, On the Unity of Intellect Against the Averroes. The synthesis was not produced by some smooth, undifferentiated stream of acceptance. It was produced by hard, contested, difficult intellectual engagement in which Christian theologians sometimes accepted what their Muslim and Jewish predecessors had argued, and sometimes modified it, and sometimes flatly rejected it, and sometimes, as in 1277, saw the church politically condemn it. And yet, the synthesis was still real. Aquinas, the man most identified with it, was canonized in 1323, fewer than 50 years after his death. And his work was officially embraced by the Catholic Church as central to its intellectual tradition. The conflict and the synthesis coexisted. Both belong to the record. That a thing is contested does not mean it did not happen. It means it was alive. So what do we take from this story? The center of gravity of this whole episode is a single sentence. and it is 3,000 years old. Even the king is under the law. Hold our own moment up against it. Apply the liberty test to Samuel's warning the way Samuel himself applied it without the name. Samuel described a ruler who would take sons for his wars, take daughter for his service, take fields and harvest and flocks for his treasury, and in the end, take the people themselves as servants. Avadim, the word for slaves. Now look honestly at the modern state that taxes the fruit of your labor, that conscripts for war when it judges the moment right, that regulates the use of your property to its own purposes, that asserts authority over the details of your life in 1,000 particulars. Ask the hard question. Is the modern state materially different from the king Samuel warned against? Or have we just simply described the same office, wearing different clothes, justified by different words? Samuel's whole point was that the warning is structural, not personal. It is not about whether the man in the office is good or bad. It is about what the office is and what its existence requires of the people who grant it. That question did not expire. It is exactly as live today as it was then. And to take the second piece of the Hebrew inheritance, the prophetic vocation, the individual man with no office and no army who walks up to power and says, "Thou art the man." Ask yourself what the modern equivalent is. Who carries that vocation now? Who stands up without institutional protection and tells power that it has broken the law that binds it? And what does it cost them when they do so? The Hebrew tradition did not promise that the prophet would be heard. Several of them were killed. What it established was that the function exists and that it is honorable, and that a free people need someone willing to perform it. That too is part of what we inherited. And there's one more thing the Liberty Lens reveals tonight, and it is gentler than the others. This episode is, at its core, an act of acknowledgement. The wisdom at the root of American liberty was not built by one people on one continent and one faith. It was carried across the centuries by Hebrew prophets and Greek philosophers, by Muslim judges in Córdoba and Jewish scholars in Cairo, by Christian theologians in Paris and translators in Toledo. The man who insists that the founding was a product of one civilization is not defending the founding. He is shrinking it. The honest inheritance is larger and richer and more human than any chauvinism could ever fit inside. A free people can afford to tell the truth about where its ideas came from. Only an insecure one cannot. This is the inheritance, not the property of one tribe, a common cord woven from 3 cities and handed forward to us. We began with the visual in Baghdad of a manuscript on one pan of a scale and gold on the other. Let us end with the image that holds this whole episode together. For 500 years, when the Christian West had lost its inheritance, the wisdom of the ancients was kept alive in cities most Americans were never taught to think about. Baghdad, Córdoba, Cairo, Toledo. It was bought by the ounce, argued over for lifetimes, copied and corrected and carried from one language into the next by men of 3 faiths who did not always love one another and sometimes made war on another, but who agreed, at least at the level of the work, that wisdom was worth saving. And because they saved it, a Christian friar in Paris could read his Aristotle. And because he could read his Aristotle, the men in Philadelphia could inherit a tradition 14 centuries deep. The thread does not run straight from Athens to America. It ran through Jerusalem and through Baghdad and through Córdoba and through Toledo. It nearly broke a dozen times. It held because in every generation someone was willing to carry it. That is what an inheritance is. It is not a possession. It is a relay. It lives only as long as someone in each generation is willing to take it up and hand it forward. The Hebrew prophets handed forward the king under the law. The house of wisdom handed forward the Greek inheritance it had no obligation to save. Toledo handed it into Latin. Aquinas handed it into the Christian tradition, and the founders took it up and handed it to us. The question this series keeps asking in every episode is the same one. Is it our turn now? Are we still willing to read, to learn, to comment, and to contribute? Next Saturday in episode 4, the thread comes to the man who tied all of these strands together, Thomas Aquinas, and to the medieval world that put the inheritance to immediate political use. We will take up the Magna Carta and the principle that even the king is bound by law, made concrete on an English meadow. The natural law tradition of Aquinas and the radical claim that an unjust law is no law at all, and the early arguments for the right to resist tyranny. The Latin West, having recovered its inheritance through the routes we trace today, was about to discover what that inheritance demanded of it. And this coming Tuesday, in our contemporary application episode, we will talk about covenant, consent, and the critique of power. We take the Hebrew inheritance of this episode and hold it against our own politics. We ask whether American government still operates by covenant and consent, or whether it has drifted toward the very things Samuel warned the elders about. We ask who carries the prophetic vocation now, the whistleblower, the independent journalist, the dissenter without institutional cover, and what does it cost them? And we ask what it means to honor a debt to civilizations whose political arrangements we do not share. I am Jeff Gellick, and this has been episode 3 of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and Empire of Liberty. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. Like, comment, share the videos, and help us beat the algorithms so that more people can see this content. And follow me on X, @JKellick, for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.